I never thought a simple lost notebook could turn an ordinary night into something that would change two lives forever. But that is exactly what happened the moment Emily Carter picked it up from the cold subway seat in downtown New York City. It was just after 11:30 p.m., the kind of hour when the trains feel empty, but the city still hums like it is holding its breath. Emily, wearing her navy cleaning uniform and pushing a worn cart with supplies, had been working her usual late shift at the underground station, wiping down benches, collecting trash, and trying to finish before the last train rushed through. Her life was simple, structured, and predictable, built around long hours and quiet routines. Yet on that night something broke that pattern in the smallest possible way. On a bench near the far end of the platform, she noticed a dark leather notebook resting slightly tilted, as if someone had left it behind in a hurry. At first, she almost ignored it, because people forgot things all the time in a city like this, but something about it felt different, heavier in meaning than its physical weight suggested. She looked around the platform. Only a few passengers remained, each lost in their own world, none appearing to search for anything. Emily hesitated, then reached out and picked it up, feeling the cool texture of the leather against her fingers. The moment she opened it, she saw pages filled with sharp handwriting, numbers, schedules, and notes that looked far too precise to belong to something ordinary. She did not understand most of it, but she understood enough to know it was important. At the same time, high above the city in a glass-walled office overlooking Manhattan, Daniel Whitmore stood alone, staring at a digital security feed replaying a moment he had been dreading. The realization hit him like a quiet shock. The notebook was gone. Not just any notebook, but the one thing that contained the fragile structure holding together deals, warnings, and private truths that could not fall into the wrong hands. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he simply turned to his assistant and said in a controlled tone that it needed to be found immediately, no matter what it took. Back in the subway station, Emily closed the notebook again, suddenly aware that she should not be holding it, yet unsure what to do next. A part of her wanted to hand it to Lost and Found and forget about it. But another part, the cautious part shaped by years of struggling to stay afloat in an expensive city, told her that nothing this detailed was ever just lost. As she stepped toward the exit with the notebook tucked carefully inside her bag, she noticed something unusual. A man in a dark coat standing too still near the edge of the platform, watching, not the trains, but her. A small tension formed in her chest, subtle but undeniable, as if the night had quietly shifted its direction. Above her, unseen systems were already beginning to move, connections forming between missing data, a powerful name, and an ordinary woman who had no idea she had just stepped into something far larger than her world had ever prepared her for. Emily Carter walked faster than usual as she left the subway station, the leather notebook pressed tightly inside her shoulder bag like it suddenly weighed more than it should. And although the city around her continued its normal rhythm of taxi horns, distant sirens, and late-night footsteps, she could not shake the feeling that something about the night had changed in a way she could not explain. Back at Whitmore Industries, Daniel Whitmore stood in front of a large wall display showing live transit camera feeds, his expression controlled but focused, as a team of security analysts worked quietly behind him to trace the last known movement of the missing notebook. And for Daniel, this was not just about an object, but about timing, control, and the possibility that something extremely sensitive had just slipped beyond his reach. In a separate office nearby, his assistant confirmed that the notebook contained references to financial transfers, internal project codes, and names that were not meant to be visible outside a very small circle of executives. And that confirmation turned a quiet concern into a structured response plan. Meanwhile, Emily arrived at her small apartment in Queens, a modest space with worn furniture and a flickering hallway light outside her door, and she placed her cleaning cart in the corner before slowly pulling the notebook out again, studying its pages under a dim lamp, noticing patterns that suggested planning far beyond anything she had ever seen in her daily life. She did not know the names written there, but she recognized repetition, urgency, and structure, the kind of organization that suggested money, power, and risk moving quietly behind closed doors. As she turned another page, her phone suddenly buzzed, showing an unknown number with no caller identification, and after a brief hesitation, She answered only to hear a calm voice on the other end asking her if she had recently found something that did not belong to her, a question that immediately tightened her grip on the phone. She did not answer directly, instead asking who was calling, but the line ended seconds later, leaving only silence and a growing sense that she was now being observed in ways she did not understand. At the same time, Daniel reviewed the same subway footage again, this time noticing a detail previously missed, a cleaning staff member near the bench at the exact time the notebook disappeared. And although there was no accusation spoken aloud, the implication was enough for his team to begin narrowing their search toward transit employees. Emily, unaware of this development, placed the notebook back into her bag and locked her apartment door, but as she looked through the small window toward the street below, she noticed the same dark vehicle parked across from her building that had not been there earlier, and for the first time she considered that what she had found on an ordinary subway bench might no longer be just a forgotten item, but something that had already drawn attention far beyond her quiet, ordinary life. The next morning arrived in New York City with gray light filtering through tall buildings, and Emily Carter woke up earlier than she needed to, not because she was rested, but because her mind never fully settled after the strange phone call and the sight of a dark vehicle outside her apartment. And as she sat at the edge of her bed, she kept thinking about the notebook hidden inside her bag like it was something that had already changed the direction of her life. Across town, Daniel Whitmore stood in a private conference room with his senior advisors, reviewing a structured report that confirmed the cleaning staff member identified in the subway footage had been traced to a residential address in Queens. And although no accusations were made aloud, the atmosphere in the room shifted toward urgency, with quiet instructions given to proceed carefully and discreetly. Emily left her apartment building and noticed the same vehicle again parked farther down the street, now partially hidden but still present, and she chose to walk a different route toward the subway station, keeping her pace steady while trying to convince herself it was just coincidence. Yet every instinct she had suggested otherwise. When she arrived at the station, her supervisor mentioned that someone from transit management had requested a record of all cleaning staff who worked the previous night, and Emily felt a subtle tightening in her chest as she realized her name could now be part of something she did not understand. At the same time, Daniel reviewed a separate set of data showing irregular financial patterns tied to internal accounts, and he confirmed to himself that the notebook was not just missing paperwork, but a critical piece of information that someone inside his own organization would want to suppress or retrieve before it reached the wrong hands. Emily, now on her shift, continued her cleaning routine but moved more cautiously than usual, noticing details she had previously ignored, such as people pausing too long at platform entrances or security staff speaking quietly into communication devices while occasionally glancing in her direction. During a break, she opened the notebook again in a small maintenance room, and as she studied it more carefully, she noticed a faint marking on one of the pages, a sequence of initials and numbers that seemed less like random notes and more like a coded reference to something larger. Without warning, her phone buzzed again with a message that simply read that returning what she found would be the safest choice, and no sender information was visible, which made the warning feel even more direct and unsettling. Meanwhile, Daniel made a decision to leave his office and personally observe the transit area connected to the last known location of the notebook, not because he expected to find it immediately, but because he needed to understand who had it and why they had not come forward yet. As the day progressed, Emily and Daniel unknowingly moved closer to the same physical space within the city system, each guided by separate motivations but connected by the same hidden object, and the tension between discovery and consequence continued to build quietly around them as the situation shifted from a simple lost item into something neither of them could fully step away from anymore. By late afternoon, the entire rhythm of New York City felt different to Emily Carter, as if every sound in the subway system carried a hidden meaning, and although she tried to focus on her cleaning duties, her attention kept drifting back to the notebook she had hidden inside her locker, now feeling less like an accidental find and more like something that had quietly placed her in the center of a situation she did not ask for. At the same time, Daniel Whitmore arrived at a transit control office near Midtown Manhattan, accompanied by a small security team, and while he did not draw attention to himself, His presence alone shifted the energy of the room as he requested a review of the internal staffing logs and security access records connected to the previous night. Emily was called briefly to the supervisor office under the pretext of routine questioning, where she was asked simple questions about her shift, her location, and whether she had seen anything unusual on the platform. And although she answered calmly, she noticed that the questions were too specific to feel random. As she returned to work, she felt a growing sense that she was being quietly observed, not in an aggressive way, but in a structured and deliberate manner, as if someone was connecting information around her without directly revealing themselves. Meanwhile, Daniel reviewed a live feed from the subway platform and finally confirmed a visual match between the cleaning staff member and the time window of the notebook disappearance. And instead of reacting immediately, he paused, studying the situation carefully, aware that rushing forward could expose the wrong assumptions. Emily, now finishing her shift, opened the notebook one more time inside a storage area beneath the station. And this time, she noticed a small embedded chip-like marking inside the cover that suggested it was not an ordinary personal journal, but something designed for controlled information tracking. Her phone buzzed again, but this time there was no message, only a brief unknown call that disconnected after a few seconds, leaving her with silence that felt heavier than words. Outside the station entrance, Daniel stood at a distance for the first time, observing the flow of people, and although he did not yet approach Emily directly, he finally saw her in person and confirmed she was the same individual connected to the missing item. Yet something about her behavior did not match the profile of someone intentionally involved in theft or concealment. That uncertainty made him hesitate, and instead of sending security personnel, he made a decision to approach the situation differently, choosing to observe longer before acting. As evening began to fall over the city, Emily left the station unaware that Daniel was only a short distance away, and for the first time both of their paths were aligned within the same physical space, setting the stage for an encounter that neither of them could avoid much longer as the truth behind the notebook continued to tighten its grip around their lives. The moment Emily Carter stepped out of the subway station that evening, the air felt colder than usual, not because of the weather, but because of the growing sense that her life had become part of something she could no longer see clearly. And as she walked toward the street, she noticed that the same dark vehicle from earlier was now parked closer to the corner of the intersection. Its position changed just enough to confirm it was no longer a coincidence in her mind. Inside that vehicle, unknown to her, a quiet observation continued as information was shared between individuals tracking patterns of movement linked to the subway system. But no one approached her directly, creating an invisible pressure that followed her every step. At the same time, Daniel Whitmore finally made his move from a distance, choosing not to confront her immediately, but to follow her path from across the street while maintaining separation, studying her behavior as she moved through the crowded sidewalk with the notebook still hidden inside her bag. Emily eventually stopped at a small convenience store to buy water, trying to steady herself after hours of feeling watched. And while she was inside, Daniel observed from outside the glass window, noticing that she did not appear defensive or secretive, only confused and slightly anxious, which complicated his assumptions about her involvement. When Emily exited the store, she sensed something shift again, like someone had adjusted their position nearby, and without realizing it, she began walking faster toward her apartment building, while Daniel followed at a distance that allowed him to remain unseen, but still close enough to track her direction. During this quiet pursuit, Daniel reviewed additional data on a handheld device, confirming that the notebook contained access-sensitive material tied to internal financial movements within Whitmore Industries. Yet the fact that it had ended up with someone like Emily created an inconsistency he could not ignore. Emily reached her building entrance and paused for a moment before going inside, feeling an unusual hesitation as if crossing a threshold she did not fully understand anymore. And behind her, Daniel stopped at the opposite side of the street, finally deciding not to follow her further that night. Instead, he made a call instructing his team to suspend any aggressive retrieval actions until he could confirm her intentions personally, a decision that marked a shift from control to observation. Inside her apartment, Emily placed the notebook on her table instead of hiding it immediately, staring at it for a long moment as if it might explain why her ordinary life had suddenly become entangled with unknown forces. Meanwhile, Daniel stood under the city lights, watching her building from a distance, realizing that the next step would require direct contact. And as both of them remained in separate spaces only a few hundred feet apart, the situation reached a silent turning point where avoidance was no longer possible and an inevitable meeting was now only a matter of time. The next morning in New York City began with an unusual calm that felt misleading to Emily Carter, as if the city itself was pretending nothing had changed. Yet she woke up with the same notebook still resting on her table exactly where she left it the night before. And for a few seconds, she simply stared at it while trying to decide whether the safest choice was to finally report it or continue holding on to something she did not fully understand. Across town, Daniel Whitmore stood in a private meeting room alone, having instructed his team to pause all tracking activity overnight. And instead of escalating the situation, he reviewed everything once more from the beginning, including the moment the notebook went missing, the transit footage, and Emily Carter's profile. Noticing that nothing in her background suggested intentional involvement with sensitive corporate material, Emily left her apartment earlier than usual, carrying the notebook in her bag once again, but this time with a stronger sense that returning it might not be as simple as it seemed, especially after the repeated calls, the silent vehicle, and the feeling that she was being observed without direct contact. When she arrived at the subway station, she noticed something different in the atmosphere, as if the usual routine had been slightly disrupted, and transit staff seemed more attentive than before, occasionally communicating in low voices near security checkpoints. Daniel arrived at the same station shortly after, not in a visible executive capacity, but dressed in a simple dark coat, blending into the crowd while maintaining a careful distance as he observed Emily from across the platform for the first time without any screens between them. Emily felt that same presence again, the sensation of being watched, and she instinctively tightened her grip on her bag while continuing her duties, unaware that the person observing her was the same individual connected to the notebook she carried. At one point during the morning, Emily opened the maintenance storage area to take a short break, and she looked again at the notebook, noticing details she had missed before, including structured references that seemed to point toward internal systems and financial coordination far beyond anything she had ever encountered in her daily life. Daniel, observing from a distance, finally made the decision to approach indirectly by requesting a private meeting through transit administration channels, ensuring it would appear routine rather than confrontational, and the request was forwarded to Emily's supervisor within the hour. When Emily was informed that she was asked to meet someone regarding a lost item report, she felt a wave of uncertainty but agreed, believing that refusing would only make the situation more complicated. As the afternoon approached, both Emily and Daniel moved unknowingly toward the same designated office within the Transit Authority building, each carrying different levels of understanding but connected by the same object that had already shifted the direction of both their lives, and the space between them was slowly closing without either of them fully realizing how significant the next conversation would become. When Emily Carter entered the Transit Authority building that afternoon, she felt an unfamiliar heaviness in the air, not because the space itself had changed, but because she knew she was walking into a meeting connected to something she did not fully understand. And as she passed through the security checkpoint, she noticed that her name had already been logged in advance, which made her feel as if the situation had been arranged before she ever arrived. Inside the same building, Daniel Whitmore waited in a private conference room under a simplified identity clearance, avoiding any formal introduction that would reveal his full position, because he wanted to see Emily without the weight of his corporate title influencing the moment. Emily was guided down a quiet hallway and eventually into the meeting room, where she saw Daniel for the first time in person without knowing who he truly was, only noticing that he carried a calm but focused presence that immediately made the atmosphere feel more serious than she expected. Daniel began the conversation carefully, asking about the night she found the notebook, not with accusation but with controlled curiosity, and Emily responded honestly, explaining that she had simply discovered it on a subway bench during her cleaning shift and had no idea it contained anything important. As she spoke, Daniel studied her expressions closely, noticing consistency in her answers and a lack of defensive behavior, which conflicted with the initial assumption that she might have been intentionally involved. Emily then revealed that she had been receiving anonymous calls and messages since the night she found the notebook, and that someone had even appeared to be watching her building, which immediately shifted Daniel's focus from suspicion toward concern about an external third party. Daniel did not reveal his full identity yet, but he asked to see the notebook, and after a brief hesitation, Emily placed it on the table, allowing him to carefully examine its contents for the first time outside of corporate security systems. As Daniel reviewed the pages, his expression tightened slightly, not with anger, but with recognition of deeper internal vulnerabilities within his own organization, and he realized that the situation was no longer just about recovering lost property, but about identifying a breach that could not be ignored. At that moment, Emily asked directly who he was and why this notebook mattered so much, and Daniel paused before choosing a partial truth, telling her that it was connected to internal corporate information that had been improperly exposed. Instead of reacting with fear or denial, Emily expressed frustration that she had been placed in danger without understanding the reason, and that honesty should have been part of the situation from the beginning. Daniel acknowledged her point quietly, and for the first time, he made a decision not to treat her as a suspect or a bystander, but as someone who had unintentionally become part of a larger problem. As the meeting ended, Daniel suggested that she should not continue handling the situation alone, and Emily left the room with more questions than answers, while Daniel remained behind, fully aware that the next step would require them to work together to understand who was truly behind the growing pressure surrounding the notebook, as the situation had now clearly evolved into something neither of them could resolve independently. After the meeting ended, Emily Carter stepped out of the Transit Authority building with a different sense of awareness, as if the world around her had become more detailed and more uncertain at the same time. And although she still did not fully understand Daniel Whitmore's role in everything, she now knew that the notebook was not just a forgotten object, but part of a situation that extended far beyond her daily life. Outside the building, Daniel remained inside for several more minutes reviewing internal notes, confirming once again that the material in the notebook pointed toward irregular financial movement patterns that could not be explained by external systems alone, suggesting involvement from someone with internal access. He made a decision to continue observing rather than acting immediately, and for the first time, he considered that Emily might be the only stable point in a situation filled with unknown variables. Emily returned to the subway station to finish her shift, but everything felt slightly different, as if she was no longer just performing routine work, but moving through a system that was now quietly aware of her presence. During her shift, she noticed that transit staff behavior had become more structured, with certain areas being monitored more closely than before, and she could sense that indirect attention was still present, even if it was no longer as visible as it had been earlier. Meanwhile, Daniel reviewed additional background information about Emily, confirming again that her life history showed no indication of involvement in financial or corporate environments, which increased his suspicion that she had been unknowingly placed into the situation rather than actively participating in it. Later that evening, Daniel made the decision to send a controlled message through official transit channels, requesting that Emily remain available for further questions related to the notebook, but this time the tone of communication was carefully adjusted to avoid pressure or intimidation. Emily received the message while taking a short break and felt a mixture of confusion and frustration, realizing that her life had become tied to instructions from people she barely understood, yet she also recognized that ignoring the situation would not make it disappear. At the same time, unknown to both of them, a separate internal review within Daniel's organization continued to identify inconsistencies in data access logs, suggesting that someone with higher-level clearance might be attempting to trace or suppress the information contained in the notebook. As night approached, Daniel and Emily both remained in the same city but in different locations, each thinking about the same object from different perspectives, and although they were no longer in direct contact, the situation between them had evolved into a fragile connection built on necessity, uncertainty, and the growing realization that the truth behind the notebook was still not fully exposed, and what had already been revealed was only the beginning of a much larger hidden structure that neither of them was yet prepared to fully confront. The final turning point arrived late at night when Emily Carter stood alone on the subway platform after her shift, holding her phone in one hand and the notebook hidden inside her bag. as she reread the official message requesting her availability for further discussion. And for the first time, she felt that ignoring it was no longer an option, because everything surrounding her had slowly evolved into a situation that was actively shaping her movements rather than simply reacting to them. Across the city, Daniel Whitmore made a final decision to leave his controlled distance and approach directly, no longer relying on indirect observation, because the internal review he had been monitoring confirmed that someone within his organization was actively attempting to trace the notebook through unauthorized channels, increasing the urgency of understanding who currently held it. Emily was instructed to return to a designated transit office for a follow-up discussion, and although she felt uncertain, she decided to go, not out of trust but out of necessity, believing that clarity could only come from facing the situation directly. When she arrived at the location, she was led into a quieter section of the building where Daniel was already waiting, this time without distance or concealment, and the atmosphere immediately shifted into something more direct and serious. Daniel began by explaining that the notebook contained sensitive internal information connected to financial systems within his company, but he also made it clear that Emily was not being treated as a suspect, because all available evidence suggested she had no involvement beyond accidental possession. Emily listened carefully, still processing how quickly her life had changed from a normal cleaning shift to being part of something involving corporate structures she never interacted with before. She then asked the question she had been holding since the beginning, which was why she had been targeted with messages and watched outside her home if she was not the problem, and Daniel acknowledged that the situation likely involved a third party attempting to recover or suppress the information before it could be properly secured. For the first time, Daniel proposed a direct partnership, asking Emily to cooperate in identifying how the notebook ended up in the subway system and whether anyone had been following its movement before she found it. Emily hesitated, not because she distrusted him personally, but because she realized that agreeing meant stepping further into a world that had already disrupted her life without warning. After a long pause,